The boy hadn't run, hadn't screamed. He just stood there in the doorway, flashlight trembling slightly in his small hand, waiting for an answer. Graham's voice cracked, dry from disuse. I'm okay. Careful. Don't come too close. The warning came out instinctively. Whatever this place had become, whatever he'd been reduced to, he still didn't want a child anywhere near it. The boy didn't listen. He took another step down, the flashlight beam bouncing off the brick walls, catching the rust on the chain looped around Graham's wrists. Why do you have that on you? The boy asked, nodding at the chain like it was the strangest thing he'd ever seen, not yet old enough to understand what it meant. Graham didn't answer right away. He studied the boy's face, round cheeks, dark eyes, a red hoodie a size too big for him, and something in his chest twisted so hard he had to look away. It's a long story, Graham finally said. What's your name? Ethan. The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Graham knew that name. He'd chosen that name. But the boy's eyes held no recognition, no memory, just curiosity, and maybe a little fear he was doing his best to hide. Ethan, Graham repeated quietly, testing the shape of it in his mouth like he hadn't spoken it in years, though it had only been 3 months. If this story is hitting you the way it's hitting us, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from tonight. We love seeing how far this reaches. Now, back to the basement. 3 months earlier, Graham Han had been the last person anyone expected to end up chained to a wall in his own house. He'd built Han Global Textiles from a single factory his father left behind into one of the largest manufacturing groups on the East Coast, with plants stretching from South Carolina to Busan. 22 years of 18-hour days, of missed dinners and rescheduled birthdays, he swore he'd make up for later. He told himself the sacrifice was temporary, that once the company was stable, once the next acquisition closed, once the board finally stopped questioning every decision he made, he'd slow down. He'd be the father he kept promising Ethan he'd be. He never got the chance. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning. His brother-in-law's cousin, Levi, a man Graham had personally hired into a VP role 6 years earlier out of loyalty to family, asked for an emergency meeting with the board. Graham walked into that boardroom expecting a routine budget dispute. Instead, he found 5 printed folders waiting on the table, each one stamped with his name and a list of financial discrepancies he'd never seen before. Falsified vendor invoices, wire transfers routed through shell accounts in his name, a pattern of embezzlement that, on paper, looked airtight. This isn't real, Graham said, flipping through pages that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. I didn't authorize any of this. Levi sat at the head of the table, a seat that had always been Graham's, arms folded, face composed in a way that told Graham this wasn't the first time he'd rehearsed this moment. The evidence says otherwise, Levi said. The board's already seen it. Graham looked around the room. Faces he'd worked beside for over a decade wouldn't meet his eyes. Except one, his mother-in-law, seated quietly near the window, hands folded, watching him the way a person watches something they'd already decided the ending of. Grandma Han, he said, though the words tasted strange, because in that moment he understood, with a cold and sudden clarity, that this hadn't started with Levi at all. She didn't blink. Sit down, Graham. You're only making this harder on yourself. He didn't sit. He turned to leave the room, already reaching for his phone to call Rachel, to call anyone who might still believe him, and found 2 of the company's private security staff waiting just outside the door. Mr. Han, one of them said, not unkindly but firm, we need you to come with us. He wasn't arrested. There were no police, no headlines that day. That, Graham would later realize, was the worst part. How quiet it all was. How easily a man's entire life could be dismantled inside a boardroom with the doors closed, with nobody outside ever hearing the walls come down. They didn't take him to a police station. They took him home. Rachel was waiting in the foyer when he arrived, her face already changed. Not the openly warm expression she usually greeted him with, but something guarded, uncertain, like she was looking at a stranger wearing her husband's face. "Rachel," he said, "whatever they told you, it's not true." "They showed me the transfers, Graham." Her voice shook. $6 million, under our names, under Ethan's college fund. "I never touched Ethan's fund." He stepped toward her, and she stepped back, just slightly, but it was enough to break something in him. "Rachel, look at me. You know me. You've known me for 11 years. I don't know what I know anymore," she said, and that was when Levi appeared behind her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder in a gesture that was somehow worse than anything he'd said in the boardroom. "For the family's sake," Levi said to Graham, calm as ever. "It's best if you stay somewhere quiet for a while, somewhere the press can't reach you, somewhere you can reflect." Somewhere turned out to be the basement of his own house, the one part of the property he'd never bothered finishing, the one room none of the staff had reason to enter. A cot, a single bulb, a door that locked from the outside. He told himself it would be a week, maybe 2. Enough time for the confusion to clear, for someone, Rachel, the board, anyone, to look closer at the numbers and realize they didn't add up. A week became a month. A month became 3. Meals came twice a day, left outside the door by a man Graham recognized but couldn't place at first. James, who'd driven the family car for nearly a decade, who used to slip Ethan extra cookies from the kitchen when Rachel wasn't looking. James never said a word during those handoffs, never made eye contact, just set the tray down and left. But Graham noticed somewhere around week 6 that the portions had quietly gotten a little larger. That the coffee, which had started out lukewarm and bitter, began arriving still warm. Small things. Things nobody else would have noticed. Graham wondered, in the long, silent hours between meals, if that was James's way of saying he didn't believe the story either. He just couldn't say so out loud. Nobody explained anything to him. Nobody asked him a single question. He existed in that basement the way a piece of furniture exists in a room nobody uses anymore. Present, accounted for, entirely forgotten. Upstairs life had apparently gone on without him. He could hear it sometimes, muffled through the floorboards. Footsteps, the faint sound of the television, once, unmistakably, Ethan's laughter drifting down through the vents, followed by Rachel's voice calling him in for dinner. Graham had pressed his ear to the pipe running along the ceiling and stayed there until his neck ached, just to hear it again. He learned later, piecing it together from things James let slip without meaning to, that the story told to the rest of the world was that he'd resigned amid a personal scandal and left the country to get his affairs in order. Levi had stepped in as interim CEO. The board had ratified it within a week, grateful, Graham suspected, for how cleanly the whole thing had been handled. Grandma Hahn made sure of that. She always did like things clean. As for Ethan, the official story Graham overheard once, through the vent, was simpler and crueler than anything. Daddy's away on a long work trip. A boy that age doesn't ask many follow-up questions. He just waits, and Graham sat in the dark and waited too, until waiting became something closer to disappearing. There were nights he thought about giving up entirely. Not the fight, that had already been taken from him, but something quieter, the will to keep track of the days. Somewhere around week 10 he'd stopped scratching marks into the wall beside his cot, the way he had at the start, because counting made the silence worse, not better. It reminded him how much time was passing without anyone once asking if he was still alive down there. He wasn't being starved. He wasn't being beaten. If anyone had ever walked in and asked, Levi could have pointed to the trays, to the cot, to the working light, and called it reasonable, called it temporary. That was, Graham realized, exactly the point. It wasn't cruelty anyone could point to and name. It was just erasure, administered carefully enough to never look like anything at all, which was what made the sound of small footsteps on the stairs that Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd month so impossible to believe at first. He thought he'd imagined it, his mind inventing sounds the way it had started inventing conversations, memories, whole imagined afternoons with Rachel just to have something to think about besides the walls. But the footsteps kept coming. And then the flashlight beam swept across the room, and there was Ethan, real, solid, standing at the bottom of the stairs in his red hoodie, looking at Graham like he'd stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to find, which, of course, he had. "Ethan?" Graham said again, quieter this time, like saying it too loudly might make the moment disappear. "How do you know my name?" Ethan asked, tilting his head, the flashlight beam dipping towards the floor. Graham opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no way to answer that honestly without giving away everything at once, and some instinct, sharper than 3 months of exhaustion should have allowed, told him not to. Not yet. Not until he understood what Ethan had been told, and what might happen to both of them if the wrong person upstairs found out this door had been opened. "Someone told me about you," Graham said carefully. "You must be a very brave kid, coming down here by yourself." Ethan considered that, seeming to accept it the way children accept most things adults tell them. Not because it fully made sense, but because it was said with enough certainty to sound true. "I heard something down here at night sometimes," Ethan said. "Mom said it was just the pipes, but I wanted to check." "You should probably go back upstairs before anyone notices you're gone," Graham said, even as every part of him wanted to beg the boy to stay just a little longer. "Are you going to be okay?" Ethan asked again, and this time Graham heard something underneath the question. Not just a child's politeness, but real concern, the kind that made his throat tighten. "I will be," Graham said, and for the first time in 3 months he almost believed it. "Can you do something for me? Can this be our secret? Just for now?" Ethan thought about it with the seriousness only a 6-year-old can bring to a promise, then nodded once, firmly. "Okay," he said. "I'll come back tomorrow." He turned and climbed the stairs, flashlight beams swinging up and away, and the door clicked shut behind him, leaving Graham alone again in the dark. Except this time, for the first time since it all began, the silence didn't feel quite so absolute. Somewhere above him, life in that house would go on as it had for 3 months. Levi settling further into the role that used to be Graham's, Grandma Han watching over the family's new arrangement with quiet satisfaction, Rachel moving through her days carrying a grief she didn't yet know had been built on a lie. But down in the basement, something had shifted. A door that had never been opened by choice now had a small, steady set of footsteps that knew the way. Graham Han closed his eyes, leaned his head back against the cold brick, and for the first time since the boardroom door had shut behind him 3 months ago, allowed himself to hope. Ethan kept his promise. The next afternoon, the same soft footsteps came down the stairs, though this time they moved faster, less caution in them, more purpose, like a child who had spent the whole day waiting for permission to come back. Graham heard the door creak open before he saw the flashlight beam, and something in his chest loosened at the sound of it, the way a held breath finally releases. "I brought you something," Ethan announced before Graham could even say hello. He held up a small sandwich bag, slightly crushed, with what looked like half a granola bar inside. "I didn't eat all of it, in case you're still hungry." Graham looked at the boy for a long moment, at the offering held out with both hands like it was something precious, and felt his throat close up in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. "That's very kind of you," Graham said carefully, taking the bag when Ethan pushed it toward him. "But you don't have to give me your food. I get meals down here." "I know," Ethan said, sitting down cross-legged a few feet away, close enough to talk, but still keeping the careful distance Graham had asked for the day before. "But Mum says sharing is important, and you looked really hungry yesterday." Graham hadn't looked hungry. He'd looked broken. But a 6-year-old didn't have the vocabulary for that yet, so hunger was the closest word he had. And in some ways, Graham thought, it wasn't entirely wrong. "How was school today?" Graham asked, because it was the only question that came to him that felt normal, felt like something a father was allowed to ask. Ethan's face lit up in the way it always used to when Graham picked him up in the afternoons, back when picking him up was still something Graham got to do. "We did a project on the ocean. I drew a whale. Ms. Patterson said it was the best one, but I think she says that to everyone." "I doubt that," Graham said, and meant it. "I bet yours really was the best one." Ethan shrugged, a small, pleased shrug, and reached into his backpack, the same red one Graham remembered buying him at the start of the school year, before all of this. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it out. "I brought a copy, in case you wanted to see it." Graham unfolded the drawing with hands that weren't quite steady. A blue crayon whale, slightly lopsided, swimming through waves that looked more like triangles than water, with a small stick-figure boy waving from a boat above it. In the corner, in careful, uneven handwriting, it said, "Ethan, age 6. "This is incredible," Graham said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "You're a real artist." "You really think so?" "I know so." Ethan beamed, and for a moment, just a moment, Graham let himself forget the chain around his wrists, forget the 3 months, forget everything, except the fact that his son was sitting 3 feet away from him, sharing a granola bar and a crayon whale like it was the most ordinary afternoon in the world. He asked Graham to keep the drawing. Graham folded it carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, over his heart, where it would stay for the rest of that day and every day after. They talked like that for nearly 20 minutes, about school, about a cartoon Ethan liked, about a kid in his class named Tyler who apparently ate paste, which Ethan found endlessly fascinating and slightly horrifying. Graham found himself laughing, actually laughing, a sound so unfamiliar in that basement that it startled him when it came out. Then, from somewhere upstairs, a voice called out, faint, muffled by the floorboards, but unmistakably Rachel's. "Ethan, Ethan, where are you?" Ethan's head snapped toward the stairs, eyes wide. "I have to go," he whispered, already scrambling to his feet. "Go," Graham said quickly. "Go, it's okay. Come back when you can." Ethan paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at him with an expression Graham couldn't quite place, something between curiosity and a feeling too big for a 6-year-old to name. "I like talking to you," Ethan said simply, and then he was gone, footsteps fading up the stairs, the door clicking shut behind him. Graham sat alone in the quiet afterward, the granola bar wrapper still in his hand, the drawing folded against his chest, and allowed himself to cry for the first time in 3 months, not from grief this time, but from something that felt dangerously close to hope. The visits became a rhythm over the following days. Ethan came most afternoons, usually after school, usually with some small offering. Half a cookie, a juice box, once a plastic dinosaur he insisted Graham needed to guard the basement. Graham learned to listen for the particular sound of his footsteps, lighter and quicker than James's heavy, measured tread, and his whole body would relax the moment he recognized them. He learned things about his son that 3 months of silence had stolen from him. That Ethan had started losing his baby teeth and was saving them in a small box under his bed, convinced there was no such thing as a tooth fairy but playing along because the dollar bills were nice, that he was scared of the dark but wouldn't admit it, which was, Graham realized with a pang, probably why he'd needed a flashlight to come exploring in the first place, that he missed his father, though he still didn't know Graham was the one sitting in front of him, and talked about him sometimes, in small, wistful sentences that landed like knives. "My dad used to read to me before bed," Ethan said one afternoon, picking at a loose thread on his hoodie sleeve. "Mom does it now, but she does the voices different." "What kind of voices did your dad do?" Graham asked, keeping his own voice as steady as he could manage. "He did this really deep one for the dragon in my book. It was so silly it made me laugh every time." Ethan smiled at the memory. Then the smile faded slightly. "I miss him. Mom says he's on a work trip, but it's been really long." Graham had to look away, blinking hard, pretending to study the brick wall until he trusted his voice again. "I'm sure he misses you too, more than you know. Do you think he'll come back?" The question hung in the stale basement air, and Graham felt the full, crushing weight of everything he couldn't say, that he was right here, 3 feet away, close enough to touch, that every night since the boardroom door closed on him, he had thought of nothing except getting back to this exact conversation, except having it as himself, not as a stranger in chains that his own son had wandered into finding. "I think," Graham said carefully, "that people who love someone as much as your dad loves you always find their way back, no matter how long it takes." Ethan seemed to accept this, the way he accepted most things Graham told him, filing it away with the quiet trust of a child who hadn't yet learned that adults could be wrong, or worse, that they could lie. It was on the 6th day of visits that Ethan asked the question Graham had been dreading. "Why are you down here?" he asked, settling into his now familiar spot a few feet from Graham, tucking his knees up to his chest. "Like, really, did you do something bad?" Graham weighed his answer carefully. He couldn't tell the boy the truth. Not yet. Not without risking everything. Not without putting Ethan in a position where he might say something to the wrong person and bring this fragile, secret world crashing down before Graham had any way to protect it. But he also couldn't lie to him. Not really. Not when Ethan was looking at him with that open, searching honesty only children seemed capable of. "Some people think I did something bad," Graham said slowly. "But I didn't. Sometimes, Ethan, people can be lied about, and sometimes those lies can seem very convincing, even to people who should know better." "That's not fair," Ethan said, with the simple, unwavering conviction of someone who hadn't yet learned that fairness wasn't something the world guaranteed. "No," Graham agreed, "it's not." "Can't you just tell someone the truth?" "I'm trying to," Graham said. "It's more complicated than that, but I promise you I'm trying." Ethan considered this for a long moment, chewing on his lower lip the way he did when he was thinking hard about something. "I believe you," he said finally, with a certainty that nearly undid Graham completely. "You don't seem like a bad guy. Bad guys don't like whale drawings." Despite everything, Graham laughed, a real laugh, warm and surprised out of him. "No," he agreed. "I suppose they don't." Upstairs, the household moved through its routines, largely undisturbed by what was happening in the basement. Levi had settled into the corner office with practiced ease, taking meetings, signing off on decisions that had once required Graham's approval, slipping into the role of CEO with a comfort that made it clear, at least to himself, that this had never been a temporary arrangement in his mind. Grandma Han observed it all from her usual chair by the window, satisfied that the family's reputation remained intact, that the story, Graham's disgrace, His convenient disappearance had been accepted without much scrutiny by the board, by the staff, by the small circle of people who mattered. Rachel, for her part, had grown quieter over the past weeks. She still believed mostly what she'd been told, the transfers, the falsified records Levi had shown her with such careful, sympathetic patience. But there were nights she lay awake replaying 11 years of marriage in her mind, searching for some earlier sign of the man capable of what he'd supposedly done, and finding, disturbingly, that she couldn't locate one. Graham had never once, in all their years together, been anything but careful with money. Anxious even, the kind of man who double-checked invoices himself instead of trusting his accountants blindly. It didn't fit, but grief and betrayal made strange bedfellows with doubt, and she hadn't yet found the courage, or the reason, to pull that thread. She noticed Ethan's afternoons had changed, though. He used to come straight to his room after school, controller in hand, ready for an hour of cartoons before homework. Lately he disappeared for stretches of time she couldn't quite account for, reappearing with a strange, quiet contentment on his face that she couldn't place. "Where do you keep running off to?" she'd asked him once, only half paying attention, sorting through mail at the kitchen counter. "Nowhere," Ethan had said, a little too quickly, a little too practiced. "Just playing." She hadn't pressed. There was too much else occupying her mind those days. The company, the whispers among the staff, the strange new distance Levi kept trying to close with a kindness that felt, if she was honest with herself, slightly too eager. She filed Ethan's evasiveness away as ordinary 6-year-old secrecy, the kind that usually meant nothing more than a hidden stash of candy or an imaginary friend, and let it go. She had no reason yet to suspect the basement. Down below, Graham had begun to notice something shifting in himself, something he hadn't expected. For 3 months his mind had circled endlessly around the injustice of what had happened to him. The forged records, Levi's calm betrayal, Grandma Han's cold, calculated silence, the vertigo of watching his entire life stripped away inside a single boardroom meeting. He had spent whole days rehearsing arguments he would never get to make, drafting speeches for a board that would never let him back into the room. But since Ethan started coming, something in that relentless spiral had quieted. It wasn't that the anger was gone. If anything, it burned hotter now, sharpened by every small detail Ethan let slip about the story he'd been told, about the father he'd been taught to wait for instead of look for. But underneath the anger, something steadier had taken root. Purpose, maybe. Or hope. He no longer spent his hours simply surviving the silence. He spent them waiting for footsteps on the stairs, and in the waiting, he found a reason to keep his mind sharp, to keep himself, in whatever small ways were still available to him, ready. He began carefully to think not just about surviving, but about what came after, about how exactly a man with no phone, no lawyer, and no visitors besides a 6-year-old and a driver too afraid to speak might begin to build a way out. He didn't have a plan yet, but for the first time since the chain went around his wrists, he had something close to one forming, and it had walked in wearing a red hoodie, carrying half a granola bar and more courage than anyone else in that house had shown him in 3 months. That night, after Ethan's footsteps had faded back up the stairs and the basement had settled into its familiar, dark quiet, Graham took the folded whale drawing from his shirt pocket and studied it again in the dim light of the single bulb. Ethan, age 6. He thought about the notepad James had left behind 2 days earlier, tucked wordlessly beneath the food tray, no explanation given or needed. He thought about the phone charger, still sitting untouched in the corner because Graham had no phone to charge it. Not yet, anyway. He thought about small mercies, quietly given, and about a boy who kept a secret better than most adults could. He folded the drawing carefully and pressed it back into his pocket, over his heart, and allowed himself, cautiously, to start believing that the door at the top of the stairs might not stay locked forever. If you've made it this far into Graham's story, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from tonight. We read every single one. Now back to the basement. By the second week of visits, Graham had started keeping track of time again. Not by scratching marks into the brick the way he had at the start, but by counting the hours until Ethan's footsteps came down the stairs. It gave the days a shape they hadn't had before. A reason to wake, if sleep in that basement could even be called sleep. A reason to keep himself steady. He hadn't expected the visits to change anything beyond the four walls he was confined to. He was wrong. Rachel noticed first. It started small, the kind of thing a busy, grieving woman might not think twice about in an ordinary week. But Rachel's weeks hadn't been ordinary in months, and she'd learned, without meaning to notice things. Ethan's shoes, still damp along the soles some afternoons, as though he'd walked through the unfinished part of the basement where moisture pooled near the old drainage pipe. A faint smudge of dust on the knee of his jeans that didn't match anywhere else in the house. The way he'd stopped asking to watch cartoons the moment he got home, disappearing instead for 40 minutes, sometimes longer, always resurfacing with the same unreadable calm on his face. She asked him about it twice more, gently. The way you ask a child something you don't want to spook them out of answering honestly. Both times he told her he'd just been playing. Both times something in his voice, a beat too careful, a little too rehearsed, told her he wasn't lying exactly, but he wasn't telling her everything either. It was on a Thursday, 3 weeks into Ethan's secret visits, that she decided to follow him. She told herself it wasn't spying. She was his mother. If something or someone in this house had captured her son's attention enough to occupy him for the better part of an hour every afternoon, she had every right to know what it was. Especially now, in a house that had already proven itself capable of hiding things from her. She waited until he slipped out of the kitchen with his backpack still slung over one shoulder, the way he always did, and followed at a distance down the east hallway, past the laundry room, toward the old servant stairwell that led to the unfinished part of the basement, a part of the house she hadn't set foot in for years, not since they'd stopped using it for storage after the renovation. She reached the top of the stairwell just as the door clicked shut below. Her hand hovered over the handle. For a moment, standing there in the quiet hallway, she almost turned back. Whatever was down there, some instinct told her it wasn't a game, wasn't a hiding spot for stolen snacks or an imaginary friend. The air felt different near that door, heavier, colder, like it was holding its breath. Then she heard it, faint, muffled through the old wood. A voice, low, male, unfamiliar in tone but unmistakably present. Her stomach dropped. She pressed her ear closer, straining to make out words, but the door was thick and the voices below were quiet, careful in a way that suggested whoever was down there already knew how important it was not to be overheard. She could make out Ethan's higher voice, a fragment of laughter, and then the deeper voice again, indistinct. Someone was down there, someone Ethan had been visiting, alone for weeks, and no one, not her, not the staff she'd asked, not even James, who managed the property with such careful attention to detail, had said a word about it. Her hand finally closed around the handle. It didn't turn. Locked. She stood there for a long moment, heart hammering, turning the handle again just to be sure, rattling it slightly before catching herself and stopping, some instinct warning her not to make noise. Not yet, not until she understood what she was dealing with. She heard footsteps approaching the door from the inside, Ethan's light, familiar tread, and she stepped back quickly, retreating a few paces down the hallway just as the door clicked and Ethan slipped out, flashlight tucked under one arm, backpack bouncing against his shoulder. He froze when he saw her. "Mom?" His voice came out higher than usual, guilt written plainly across his face in the way only a 6-year-old's face can betray him. Ethan. She kept her voice as even as she could manage, crouching slightly to his level. What were you doing down there? Nothing, he said too fast. Just playing. Ethan. She reached out and gently caught his chin, turning his face up toward hers. I heard someone talking. Who's down there? His eyes went wide, darting briefly toward the locked door behind him, and Rachel watched something complicated move across his small face. The visible war between a promise he'd made and a mother he'd never lied to before. Not really. Not about anything that mattered. I can't tell you, he finally whispered. I promised. Promised who? He shook his head, lips pressed tight, and Rachel felt something cold settle into her chest. Not anger, not yet, but the particular fear of a parent realizing there was a part of her child's life she had no access to. Before she could press further, footsteps sounded from the far end of the hallway, brisk, purposeful, unmistakably Levi's. Rachel. His voice carried that same practiced warmth he always used with her now, the kind that had started in recent weeks to feel less like comfort and more like management. Everything all right? Rachel straightened, keeping one hand on Ethan's shoulder. I was just asking Ethan about this stairwell. I didn't realize anyone still used it. Something flickered behind Levi's eyes, brief, controlled, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Storage, mostly. Old furniture. Some of the archived paperwork from before the renovation. Nothing worth Ethan's time down there. Probably shouldn't be wandering around in the dark, buddy. He added, crouching slightly to address Ethan directly, his tone light, easy. Could be dangerous. Old wiring, loose boards. Best to stick to the parts of the house we keep up. Ethan said nothing, staring at the floor. I'll have someone check the lock on that door. Levi continued, straightening back up, addressing Rachel now. Make sure it stays secured. Wouldn't want him getting hurt down there. It was said so smoothly, so reasonably, that Rachel almost let it go, almost accepted it the way she'd been accepting most things lately. The story about Graham, the transfers, the sudden reshuffling of a company she'd spent over a decade watching her husband build with his own hands. But some small, stubborn part of her, the part that had once trusted her husband completely, before $6 million and a stack of falsified paperwork had convinced her otherwise, caught on something in Levi's voice, a tightness underneath the ease, a little too quick to explain, a little too eager to close the subject. Of course, she said instead, keeping her own voice light to match his. Better safe than sorry. Levi smiled, the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes, and excused himself back down the hallway. Though Rachel noticed, and would think about later, turning it over in her mind long after the house had gone quiet for the night, that he didn't leave immediately. He lingered near the end of the corridor a moment longer than necessary, as though making sure the conversation had truly ended before he allowed himself to walk away. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Rachel found herself standing at the top of the servants' stairwell again, staring at the door. She tried the handle once more, still locked. She thought about the voice she'd heard, low, male, careful, and about the way Ethan's face had crumpled at the thought of breaking a promise to whoever was on the other side of that door. She didn't know it yet, standing there in the dark hallway with her hand pressed flat against old wood. But some part of her had already started asking the questions that would eventually unravel everything Levi and Grandma Hahn had built over the past 3 months. She just didn't have the answers. Not yet. Down in the basement, Graham had heard the handle rattle. He'd frozen the moment the sound reached him, every muscle in his body going rigid, his mind racing through the narrow set of possibilities. If it was James, bringing an early meal, there was nothing to fear. If it was Levi, or worse, Grandma Hahn, checking on the property for reasons that had nothing to do with food, then the secret he and Ethan had built over the past 3 weeks, fragile as a spider web, was about to be discovered before he'd had any real chance to use it. He'd strained to listen, catching fragments of a woman's voice through the door. Rachel's voice. He realized with a jolt that hit him harder than he expected, given how many months it had been since he'd heard it clearly. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was enough. Confusion. Concern. Not yet suspicion. Not fully, but close enough that his pulse hadn't slowed for several minutes afterward. When Ethan came back the next afternoon, later than usual and more subdued, Graham knew immediately something had shifted. "My mum almost caught me yesterday," Ethan said, settling into his spot with none of his usual easy chatter. "She heard us talking." Graham felt his stomach drop. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing," Ethan said, though his voice wavered slightly. "I said I couldn't tell her, because I promised you." Graham closed his eyes briefly, torn between gratitude for the boy's loyalty and guilt at the position he'd put a 6-year-old in, asking him to keep a secret this large, this dangerous, from his own mother. "Ethan," he said carefully, "I need you to listen to me. If your mom asks you again, if anyone asks you again, I don't want you to lie to protect me. Not if it gets you in trouble, do you understand?" Ethan shook his head, stubborn in the particular way children can be when they've decided on something. "I don't want to tell. You're my friend. Friends keep secrets." "This is different," Graham started, but stopped himself, unsure how to explain to a 6-year-old the difference between a game of hide-and-seek and the kind of secret that could get both of them hurt if it fell into the wrong hands upstairs. "Uncle Levi said the door should stay locked," Ethan added, almost as an afterthought, picking at the edge of his sleeve. "He said it's dangerous down here. Old wires and stuff." Graham went very still. "Did he say anything else?" "No, just that, and that I shouldn't wander around down here anymore." Ethan looked up at him, worry creasing his young face in a way that made him look, for a brief, unsettling moment, much older than 6. "Am I going to get in trouble?" "No," Graham said firmly, reaching for a calm he didn't fully feel. "You're not going to get in trouble. I promise you that." But privately his mind was already working through what this meant. If Levi had ordered the lock checked, it meant Levi was paying closer attention than Graham had hoped. It meant the window of opportunity he'd been counting on, the quiet, unnoticed rhythm of Ethan's visits, was narrowing, and narrowing fast. He needed to move quicker than he'd planned. That evening, when the tray came sliding under the door at its usual hour, Graham found something unexpected tucked beneath the plate, a folded scrap of paper, no note attached, just 3 words scrawled in James's cramped, careful handwriting. Careful. They're watching. Graham stared at the note for a long time after James's footsteps had faded back up the stairs, turning it over in his hands like it might reveal more than those 3 words offered. It confirmed what he already suspected, that James, in his quiet, careful way, had been paying closer attention to the household's shifting tensions than anyone gave him credit for. And it told him something else, something that mattered more. James was still, in whatever limited way he could manage, on his side. Graham tucked the note into his shirt pocket, alongside Ethan's folded whale drawing, and began, for the first time since the chain went around his wrists, to think seriously about what came next. Not just surviving in that basement, but getting out of it, and doing it before Levi's growing suspicion closed the narrow window Ethan had unknowingly opened. He didn't have much. A 6-year-old's loyalty. a driver's quiet mercy. A wife whose doubt hadn't yet found its footing, but was, he sensed, beginning to stir. It wasn't much, but for a man who'd had nothing at all 3 weeks ago, it was, finally, something to work with. The note stayed with Graham for 3 days before he found a way to use it. He'd spent those days turning the same handful of facts over and over, searching for an angle. He had no phone, no pen beyond the stub of pencil James had once left, tucked in the corner of a tray. Easy to miss, easy to deny if anyone asked. He had a 6-year-old who visited faithfully but couldn't be trusted to carry anything more incriminating than a drawing without risking discovery. And he had a wife whose suspicion had been stirred but not yet convinced, a fragile, unfinished thing that could just as easily curdle into fear of him as turn into an ally. What he needed was proof. Something concrete enough that Rachel couldn't dismiss it as confusion or grief playing tricks on her. Something that didn't depend on Ethan understanding what he was carrying, because Graham refused to turn his son into a courier for evidence against a company willing to disappear a man for 3 months. If this went wrong, if Levi or Grandma Hahn ever traced it back to Ethan, Graham would never forgive himself. So he thought instead about James. James had driven Graham to work every morning for 9 years, had driven Ethan to school, had, in the strange arithmetic of household staff who become something closer to family without either side ever naming it, seen more of Graham's real life, the early mornings, the phone calls he thought no one overheard, the version of himself that existed before every word had to be measured for an audience, than almost anyone left in the house. If there was one person besides Ethan who might risk something to help him, it was James. The next evening, when the tray slid under the door, Graham was ready. He'd used the stub of pencil to write on the one surface he had available to him that wouldn't immediately raise questions if it were found, the inside of the paper meal tray liner, in handwriting small enough to require close reading, words chosen carefully in case it was intercepted before it reached the person it was meant for. James, I know this is a risk. I need one thing. My old university roommate, Thomas Whitfield, is a partner at Whitfield and Cross. If you can get a message to him, just my name and the March acquisition file was altered. He'll understand. That's all. I won't ask for more than that. It wasn't a full confession. It wasn't proof of anything on its own. But Thomas had been in the room years earlier, when Graham first raised concerns about a vendor contract that had seemed slightly off during an acquisition, concerns Graham had dismissed at the time as his own overcaution, filed away and forgotten. If Thomas heard those specific words now, in this context, he would know something was deeply wrong. He was also conveniently the kind of lawyer who asked questions first and waited for permission second. Graham folded the liner as small as he could and left it beneath his empty plate, the way he'd start leaving small things going forward, hoping James would understand what to look for without either of them ever having to speak the arrangement aloud. He didn't know, over the next 2 days of silence, whether the message had been received, ignored, or discovered by the wrong person entirely. The not knowing was its own kind of torture, worse in some ways than the isolation had been, because now there was something to lose beyond his own comfort. Now there was a plan that could fail. Rachel, meanwhile, had stopped waiting for Ethan to tell her the truth and started looking for it herself. She told herself she wasn't doing anything drastic, just being thorough, the way any reasonable person would be about $6 million and a marriage that had ended without her ever getting a real explanation. She began with the folder Levi had first shown her, the one with the wire transfer records, and this time she read it not as a wife absorbing devastating news, but as the finance-minded woman she'd been before she married into Hahn Global Textiles, a woman who had, in her 20s, spent 3 years as an auditor before Graham convinced her to come run operations at his side. She noticed it almost immediately, once she let herself actually look, instead of simply absorbing the horror of the total. The transfer dates. Every single one fell during a 2-week stretch in February, while Graham had been in South Korea for the Busan plant negotiations. A trip she remembered clearly, because she'd been the one to help him pack, because he'd called her every night at 6 a.m. Seoul time just to hear Ethan's voice before school. Graham hadn't had consistent access to a company terminal during that trip. She remembered him complaining about the hotel's unreliable Wi-Fi, about having to dictate notes over the phone to his assistant because his laptop wouldn't connect to the secure server. She sat with that discrepancy for a long time, the folder open on the kitchen island long after the house had gone quiet for the night, and felt something that had been buried under weeks of grief and confusion begin to sharpen into something else entirely. Not doubt this time, something closer to certainty. She thought about calling the company's IT department directly, asking for the access logs from that period, but stopped herself, aware suddenly of how carefully controlled the information around her had become since that boardroom meeting 3 months ago. Levi had shown her documents. Levi had explained the transfers. Levi had suggested, gently, that pursuing further explanation would only prolong her pain. She'd let him manage her grief the same efficient way he now managed the company, and it had taken her 3 months and a stubborn line of transfer dates to notice. The next morning, she did something she hadn't done in weeks. She drove to the office herself, unannounced, and asked to see the original IT access logs for the February transfer window, framing it as wanting closure, a phrase she chose deliberately because she knew it would lower whoever's guard she encountered. The records clerk, a young woman new enough to the company not to have absorbed the unspoken rule that questions about Graham's departure were discouraged, pulled the logs without hesitation. The terminal used for every single one of the 6 flagged transfers had been logged in under Graham's credentials, but the IP address routed through the building's internal network. Not Seoul, not even close. Han Global Textiles headquarters, the very building Rachel was standing in. Someone inside the company, during the exact week Graham was 12 time zones away, had used his login to move that money. Rachel sat in her car in the parking garage for nearly 20 minutes afterward, hands gripping the wheel, running through everyone who would have had both the access and the reason. It didn't take her long to arrive at the only name that made sense. She didn't confront Levi immediately. She was smarter than that now, 3 months of careful management having taught her, ironically, exactly how careful she needed to be in return. Instead, she went home, and that evening she did something she should have done the first week. She sat Ethan down, gently, and asked him one more time, framing the question differently. "Ethan," she said, kneeling in front of him in his room, "I'm not upset with you, I promise, but I need you to know that whoever's downstairs, if it's someone who needs help, someone who's been hurt, you're not breaking a promise by telling me. You'd be helping them." Ethan studied her for a long moment, the particular searching look he did when weighing whether an adult could be trusted with something important. "He said not to lie," Ethan said slowly. "He said if you asked, I shouldn't lie to protect him." Rachel's breath caught. "He said that?" Ethan nodded. "He's nice, Mum. He's not scary like Uncle Levi said. He's sad. And he has a chain on him, but I don't think he did anything bad. Bad guys don't like my whale drawing." Rachel felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. "A chain?" "On his hands," Ethan said, holding his own wrists together to demonstrate, entirely unaware of what he was describing, of what those words meant to the woman kneeling in front of him with tears already gathering in her eyes. He said it's a long story. Rachel pulled her son into her arms and held him there for a long moment, partly to comfort him, partly because she needed the moment to compose herself before he saw whatever was about to happen next on her face. "I need you to show me," she said quietly. "Tonight. Can you do that?" They went down together after midnight, when the rest of the house had gone dark, Ethan leading the way with the same flashlight he'd carried every afternoon for the past month, Rachel following close behind with her heart hammering so hard she was certain it could be heard through the walls. The door, this time, wasn't locked. James, Rachel would learn later, had quietly disabled the new mechanism Levi ordered installed. One small act of defiance layered on top of all the others he'd been offering for weeks without anyone above him noticing. Ethan pushed the door open and stepped through first, the way he always did, flashlight beam sweeping the familiar path down the stairs. "It's me," he called softly into the dark. "I brought someone." Graham looked up from where he sat against the brick wall, and for a moment, in the dim, swinging light of the bulb overhead, he and Rachel simply stared at each other across the small basement room. 3 months, 6 million falsified dollars, and an entire fabricated story suddenly collapsing into the silence between them. "Graham?" Rachel whispered, and the sound of his real name in her voice, after 3 months of it being erased from every conversation in that house, broke something open in his chest that he'd thought had gone permanently numb. "Rachel." His voice cracked on it. "You have to listen to me. All of it. I need you to listen to all of it before you decide anything." She was already crossing the room, already on her knees beside him, hands going to the chain at his wrists like she could will it open through sheer force of feeling. "I know," she said, and there were tears streaming freely down her face now. "I know it wasn't you. I checked the logs myself. The transfers, they came from inside the building. While you were in Seoul, I should have looked sooner. I should have—" "You didn't know what you were looking for," Graham said, and found, even now, even after everything, that his first instinct was still to protect her from blaming herself. Levi made sure of that. Rachel's face hardened at the name. 3 months of carefully managed grief curdling instantly into something much colder. "Levi. And your mother," Graham said quietly. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I know that's not easy to hear." Something in Rachel's expression flickered. Pain, recognition. The particular grief of realizing a betrayal ran deeper into her own family than she'd let herself imagine. But she didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't ask him to be wrong about it. Some part of her, Graham realized, had probably already suspected as much, and simply hadn't allowed herself to look directly at it until now. "We need to get you out of here," she said instead, already working at the chain with hands that shook but didn't stop. "Tonight, before they know I found out." "Rachel." Graham caught her hands, stilling them, forcing her to meet his eyes. "If we move too fast, they'll bury it. Levi's had 3 months to cover his tracks. We need proof they can't explain away, not just the two of us saying it happened." "What proof?" Graham reached into his shirt pocket, past the folded whale drawing that had sat over his heart for weeks, and pulled out the small scrap of paper he'd kept hidden beneath it since the previous morning. A second note from James, slipped under his tray that same day. 3 words that had made Graham's pulse spike with something close to hope for the first time in months. Whitfield responded, "Coming." "I have a lawyer on the way," Graham said. "Someone who'll know exactly what to do with what we have if we can just hold this together for a little longer." Ethan, still standing near the stairs, watching the 2 adults he loved most in the world, finally in the same room together, spoke up in the small, matter-of-fact voice of a child who had just realized something enormous. "Wait," he said slowly. "You're my dad." Graham looked up at him, throat too tight to speak for a moment, and simply nodded. Ethan's face crumpled, not with fear, but with something far more overwhelming. 3 months of a manufactured absence collapsing all at once into the realization that the friend he'd been visiting every day, the one who liked his whale drawing and asked about his day, and told him people who love you always find their way back, had been his father the entire time. "You knew," Ethan said, voice small. "You knew, And you didn't tell me." "I couldn't," Graham said softly. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I wanted to. Every single day I wanted to. But I needed to keep you safe, and I didn't know who I could trust yet." Ethan crossed the room in 3 quick steps and threw his arms around his father's neck, chain and all, holding on with the fierce, uncomplicated grip of a child who had spent 3 months missing someone without knowing exactly who he was missing. Rachel watched them, one hand pressed to her mouth, and felt the last of her doubt about what came next dissolve entirely. "Whatever it takes," she said quietly, more to herself than to either of them. "Whatever it takes, we're finishing this." Upstairs, the house remained dark and silent, Levi and Grandma Hun asleep in their respective wings, entirely unaware that the fragile arrangement they'd built over 3 careful months had just cracked wide open in the one room, in the house they'd been certain no one would ever think to look. Thomas Whitfield arrived 2 nights later. In the back of a nondescript sedan, James parked 3 streets over so the headlights wouldn't sweep across the front windows. He came dressed like he was attending a quiet dinner rather than smuggling himself into a house to extract evidence of a corporate coup. No briefcase, just a slim folder tucked under his jacket, a recorder in his pocket, and 11 years of friendship with Graham riding on every careful step he took across the lawn towards the service entrance James had left unlocked. Rachel met him at the door. She'd barely slept in 2 days, running on adrenaline and the particular clarity that comes from finally understanding the shape of a lie you've been living inside. She led him down through the house, past the kitchen, past the laundry room, down the servants' stairwell to the basement door that no longer locked, and watched as one of the city's sharpest litigation partners got his first look at what had been done to his old roommate. Thomas didn't say much at first. He crouched in front of Graham, studied the chain, the cot, the 3 months carved invisibly into his friend's face. And when he finally spoke, his voice was flat and controlled in the specific way Graham remembered from law school. The voice Thomas used when he was furious and refusing to let it show. "Tell me everything," Thomas said. "From the boardroom forward, don't leave anything out." It took almost 2 hours. Graham walked him through the forged folders, the wire transfers routed through his credentials while he was in Seoul, Levi's calm installation into the corner office, Grandma Han's quiet presence at the edge of every decision. Rachel added what she'd found in the IT logs, the internal IP address, the exact transfer dates that lined up with Graham's documented travel, dates that existed in flight records, hotel registrations, even time-stamped calls to Ethan's school during the very hours the money had supposedly moved under Graham's authorization. Thomas recorded all of it, took photographs of the chain, the room, the meal trays James had quietly saved rather than discarded over the past several weeks. A small, unglamorous act of foresight that would matter more than anyone realized at the time. "This is enough to move on," Thomas said finally, closing his folder. "More than enough. But I need you out of this basement before I file anything. If Levi or your mother-in-law get wind that Rachel's found the logs, they'll destroy what they can and lawyer up before we're anywhere near ready." "Then we need to be faster than them," Rachel said. Thomas looked between the two of them, then down at Ethan, asleep on the bottom stair, where he'd finally given in to exhaustion after refusing to leave his father's side. "There's a board meeting Thursday. Standard quarterly review. Levi will be presenting. If we can get you into that room, Graham, chain off, on your feet, with the documentation Rachel found and everything I can pull from the county recorder's office by then, we don't just get you out of this basement, we take back the company in front of every person who quietly let this happen." The next 2 days moved with a tension none of them had words for. James worked quietly to loosen the basement's exterior lock entirely, framing routine maintenance to anyone who asked. Rachel resumed her normal routine on the surface, pleasant, composed, giving Levi and her mother no reason to suspect anything had shifted beneath the calm she'd been performing for 3 months. It cost her more than she let anyone see, sitting across from Levi at dinner, watching him speak about quarterly projections with the same easy confidence he'd used to dismantle her husband's life, and saying nothing. Thomas worked around the clock, pulling banking records, IP logs, statements from the IT clerk who'd unknowingly helped Rachel start unraveling everything. He found, buried in a property deed search that took considerably more effort than anyone expected, something that would matter more than he initially realized, a shell account linked not to Levi alone, but jointly to Grandma Han, opened 4 months before the boardroom meeting that removed Graham. 4 months. Long enough to suggest this hadn't been a decision made in the heat of one crisis, but something planned, patiently, over time. Graham spent those final 2 days in the basement differently than he had the previous 3 months, not waiting in silence, but preparing. Ethan visited each afternoon, no longer sneaking, no longer needing to, since Rachel now sat with them, listening to her son and husband rebuild in a matter of days a connection that 3 months of lies had tried to erase entirely. "You're really coming upstairs?" Ethan asked Wednesday evening, tracing the edge of his father's wrist where the chain had finally, that morning, been cut away by a locksmith Thomas trusted personally. "Thursday," Graham promised. "I'm coming upstairs Thursday, and I'm not leaving again." The boardroom on Thursday morning looked exactly as it had 3 months earlier. The same long table, the same wide windows overlooking the harbour, the same faces gathered for what they believed was a routine quarterly review. Levi sat at the head of the table, the seat that had once been Graham's, walking confidently through a slide, projecting modest gains in the textile division's overseas operations. He was midway through a sentence about projected fourth-quarter margins when the door opened. Graham walked in wearing a suit for the first time in 3 months, thinner than he'd been, a little hollow around the eyes in a way makeup couldn't fully soften, but unmistakably himself, unmistakably present, flanked by Rachel on one side and Thomas Whitfield on the other, a folder thick with evidence tucked under the lawyer's arm. The room went silent in a way Graham would remember for the rest of his life, utensils of conversation simply stopping mid-motion, several board members half rising from their seats before catching themselves, uncertain whether they were witnessing a ghost or a scandal walking back through the door on its own 2 feet. Levi's composure cracked for exactly 1 second. A flicker, there and gone, quickly smoothed back into the easy authority he'd been wearing for 3 months like a well-tailored suit. "Graham," his voice came out measured, careful. "This is unexpected." "I imagine it is," Graham said, and for the first time since the chain went around his wrists, his voice carried the full weight of the man who'd built this company from a single factory, undiminished by 3 months of silence. "Sit down, Levi. I believe that's my chair." "Security," Levi said sharply, turning toward the door, but Thomas was already speaking, calm and clear, cutting cleanly through the moment before it could tip toward chaos. "Before anyone calls security," Thomas said, laying his folder open on the table with the deliberate ease of a man who had given hundreds of courtroom openings and knew precisely how to command a room. "I'd like the board to see the actual banking logs from the 6 transfers that were used to remove Mr. Han from this company 3 months ago. Every single transfer originated from an internal IP address at this building. During a week Mr. Han was in Seoul, a fact easily verified by his flight records, hotel registration, and phone logs, all of which I've included here." He slid copies down the table. Board members who hadn't moved a muscle a moment earlier now reached for the pages with visible unease, several exchanging glances that made clear that this was the first genuine doubt any of them had allowed themselves in months. "I'd also like the board to know." Thomas continued, that a shell account jointly held by Levi Han and Grandma Han was opened 4 months before this so-called scandal, predating any of the events used to justify Mr. Han's removal. The room erupted into low, urgent conversation, board members turning to each other, to the documents, to Levi, whose easy composure had entirely evaporated, replaced by the tight, calculating look of a man watching a plan he'd spent months building collapse in real time in front of the exact people whose trust he'd need to survive the next 5 minutes. "This is absurd," Levi said, standing now, voice climbing towards something less controlled than he likely intended. Fabricated evidence, a convenient story, timed for maximum effect. "The IP logs came from your own IT department," Rachel said, speaking for the first time since walking into the room, her voice steady despite 3 months of grief that had, until days ago, been built entirely on Levi's careful lies. "I pulled them myself. Would you like to explain to the board why money moved under my husband's credentials from inside this building while he was documented verifiably on another continent?" Levi opened his mouth, then closed it, glancing toward the door as though calculating whether there was still a version of this moment he could walk away from cleanly. It was in that exact silence, thick with the sound of an empire quietly collapsing under its own forged weight, that the boardroom door opened again, and Grandma Han stepped through it, having been alerted, apparently, by someone in the building who'd caught wind of the commotion. She stopped just inside the doorway, taking in the scene in a single, sweeping glance, Graham upright and alive at the head of the table where he belonged, Rachel standing firmly at his side rather than at Levi's, Thomas's evidence spread across the table for a dozen board members to examine, and Levi frozen mid-collapse in front of all of them. Her expression, for the briefest moment, showed something Graham had never once seen on her face in over a decade of family gatherings, formal dinners, and boardroom pleasantries. "Fair, Graham," she said, her voice carrying none of its usual cold command, something almost fragile underneath it now. "There's a great deal here you don't understand." "Then explain it," Graham said quietly, and the entire room turned to look at her, waiting. She opened her mouth to speak. And it was in that exact moment, before a single word left her lips, before anyone in that room learned what she'd been about to say, that one of the board members near the window suddenly turned sharply toward the glass, phone pressed to his ear, face going pale as he listened to whatever was being said on the other end. "There's something you all need to see," he said, voice tight, already turning his laptop screen towards the table. "It's live, on every news channel right now." The room turned toward the screen together, and whatever was on it made even Thomas Whitfield, a man who rarely reacted to anything in a courtroom, go completely still. If you've stayed with Graham's story this far, you already know it isn't over yet, and you don't want to miss what happens next. Hit subscribe now, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from tonight, because Part 6 is coming. And what's on that screen is about to change everything anyone in that boardroom thought they understood about this family. There's a lesson underneath everything Graham lived through in that basement, and it's one worth sitting with long after the screen goes dark. The people who try hardest to silence you are usually the ones most afraid of what you'll say once you're finally heard. 3 months of silence couldn't erase the truth. It only delayed it. And sometimes the smallest, most overlooked person in the room, a child too young to understand the stakes, too honest to know how to lie convincingly, turns out to be the one brave enough to open the door everyone else was too afraid to touch.